Spectrovision Radio.
My name is Scott Lee Dugan. Back in May of 2010, I drove from central Philadelphia all the way to Edenton, Louisiana, a tiny rural town about 20 miles north of Lafayette, to claim an unexpected inheritance. It was 51 degrees when I left the north, and 88 when I arrived at the property that the law firm of Bell, and Rohrman had informed me was now mine, left to me by an uncle I'd barely known. I'd never in my life experienced that kind of sapping humidity, with bruised clouds lingering above me for the last 2 full hours of the trip, constantly threatening a storm but never quite bursting. Having no interest in relocating south, I decided to have the property sold immediately, and the law firm had even hooked me up with a realtor. So my trip was really more of an oddball vacation I could afford, mostly because the sale of the land would be bringing me some money eventually. Otherwise, this kind of week-long jaunt would have pressed hard on a rehab assistant's pay. When I'd first been told there was a house that came with it all, visions of gold danced in my head, but there was some not-so-great news there. When it appeared on the smooth green plain in the distance, the house looked impressive. Very narrow, but 3 stories high. A real, old-school white farmhouse sitting on 14 acres. Only upon going inside did I set eyes on what had already been hinted at, which was that this house was completely unlivable. There'd been a big fire back in 2003, when my uncle was apparently trying to teach himself a magic trick, and every bit of the damaged furniture and the flooring above ground level had been ripped up and hauled away. To keep the whole structure from collapsing, cheaply cut log beams had been laid across the expanse at 10-foot intervals like a Tinker Toy set. Some hoped-for renovation never happened, and my uncle never lived on the property again, spending his last, quiet, unmarried years in some elder care apartment in Opelousas. My father once described him as a nutcase, and almost never spoke to him beyond their 20s. I entered the house at dusk on May 12th, carrying my sleeping bag just in case there was no serviceable spot inside to flop on. On this count, I made absolutely the right call. The house was so musty that my skin itched. What was left of my uncle's junky, mismatched furniture looked about twice as old as it probably was. He had vintage framed photographs on the walls that were occasionally borderline pornographic. Each was a trifle cloudy behind a film of dust. I craned my neck and looked directly upward, dismayed and disoriented by how far away the ceiling seemed. Every move I made echoed just a little. I was immediately convinced there must be bats way up there, but it was too dark to see into those distant wooden crevices. It was eerie, the effect of being at the very bottom of a structure as tall and narrow as that. I would have buckled under and headed to a motel if the power and water hadn't been working, but they were, and I was very pleased with myself for asking the realtor to call ahead to have that set up. Telling myself I was saving $80 a night, I stretched the sleeping bag over a lumpy sofa in the living room and listened to FM radio on my uncle's Radio Shack stereo system as I ate a combo meal from the last Wendy's I'd spotted on the interstate. We Dugans were always a classy bunch, all right. The storm, after rumbling low in the distance for hours, finally did erupt past midnight. I lay there sweating because there was no air conditioning. All I could find was a table fan that looked like war surplus. The rain pounded the house and set off a chain reaction of creaks, taps, and tinny pings in the walls all around me. Spaced out at agonizingly perfect intervals, each seemed to be trying to keep me awake and let me know I was in someone else's house, and not especially welcome. I had 4 days before the appraisers came and started the process of listing the house and the property. My intention was to go for long walks, ramble around town a little, and read a couple of Octavia Butler novels, all the while salivating just a little over what the impending money might do for me, even if I guessed real low on the ultimate figure because the house was just about useless and the land was probably a swamp. In the morning, I drove into town to get takeout coffee and then went on my exploratory hike of the land, feeling very much like a 17th century noble looking for serfs to harass. The sky stayed gray and visibly agitated as I walked, and the air stayed sticky. Even wearing shorts and a t-shirt seemed a little much. Broken lines of trees on the property divided the sleepy fields into shapeless sections, and it was pleasant to stroll between them down a naturally worn footpath not much wider than a garter snake leading east. Much of the acreage was choked by an infinite carpet of densely packed, unmowable foliage that had clearly grown wildly out of control. The ground cover was a foot high in some places. It all looked like some giant mythical plant monster had laid down on everything and curled up to sleep forever. In one spot, the mass bulged toward the sky in a slightly sinister way, and I realized what I was looking at was a shed that had been entirely swallowed by the foliage from floor to roof, leaving only isolated patches of rusting metal peeking out. I couldn't have even gotten to it, so dense was that mass before me. It took about 15 minutes to reach what felt like the far edge of the property. Here was something a little different, an almost perfectly flat patch of harmless grass bordered on two sides by dense woods. The patch was maybe 40 yards wide and 30 long, unmaintained but oddly smooth, as if a secret league of sheep or goats grazed here sometimes to keep it presentable. If I were a kid, I would have played wiffle ball on it and made a rule that if you could knock one past the tree line, it was an automatic home run. I was seized at last with the pride of ownership, and with the feeling that I needed to do something conscious to celebrate my status as a land baron, fleeting though that would be. It was god-awfully hot, and my Temple University t-shirt was getting soaked through with sweat, so I pulled it off me, then kicked off my tennis shoes, and walked toward the center of the field, loving the squish of my feet on the soft, wet ground. This was something I never got to feel in city life up north. Only a single hip shimmy separating me from total nudity, I tilted my head to the sky and breathed in freedom and peace and solitude. Life at that moment was very good. I lost my balance a little at the field's midpoint when my feet sunk 2 full inches into the grass, toes all but vanishing. The water squeezing the earth was warm and comforting, and I laughed a little at the way the property seemed to be trying to consume me. I stood very still, looking off at the trees leading deep into a humid gloom. I thought I saw an eagle floating above them, backdropped by those dark clouds. That was as far as I pushed my luck with the weather, and I headed back to the house for a mid-morning nap. As I walked, I looked more closely at the hungry foliage all around, and noticed for the first time at the house that even though the stuff thinned out greatly there, it had still managed to begin to climb up the foundation on the south side. Maybe in time, if no one did anything to stop it, it would devour the place entirely, leaving just a green phantom protrusion on the skyline to spook passers-by on lonely Gallatin Road. From the woman behind the information desk at the tiny Edenton Library, I found out that the hungry foliage was called kudzu. It was an invasive plant species referred to as the vine that ate the South. If left unchecked, it could slowly swallow entire mansions whole, climbing and coiling. And it was such a pervasive enemy, there was no way it could be wholly defeated. It was a fast, stealthy thief, stealing the light from whatever flora lay helpless beneath it. After another cup of coffee from the one place that sold it in town, the Star Diner, I went for an improvised country drive that felt like it slowly and randomly circled my property, more or less. I passed farms, a trailer park, a place that sold antiques out of a barn, not much else. Taking a chance on an eroded, snaking road called Soldier's Lane, I got the sense I was very close to the house. And then, yes, there it was in the distance, seen briefly when a gap among the trees opened and just as quickly closed again. I kept going another half mile and came across something very odd on the flat landscape. With absolutely no one around, I felt I could simply leave the car on the side of the shoulderless road, and I got out to investigate. I was on an open, meandering plain where the kudzu had asserted near total domination. I wondered just how many decades it had taken to claim everything my eyes could see. 100 yards off the road, a single anomaly rose up from that strangled plain. An enormous freestanding wall. It was covered with vines that had maybe stretched outward over many years from the nearby tree line. I suspected that if I parted that tree line and headed west, I'd eventually come out somewhere near the spot where I'd soaked my feet that morning. I tramped over to the wall, my sneakers getting muddy, occasionally needing to use them to rip a vine or two. The wall stood about 15 feet high and was made of ordinary industrial cement. It looked like a crumbling ruin that had somehow survived from some much larger attached structure. The sense of unrevealed history it gave off as I stood before it was thick, heavy as the air on that 85-degree day. The kudzu had climbed all the way up to the top in a messy L pattern and crept over it. Seemed to me like one good hurricane would topple the thing. I felt while I was there that I should touch the wall, make a connection with it. So I did. The dingy, blackened cement was wet and a bit slimy. A couple of incoming stray raindrops glanced off my bare arms. That was my cue to get back to the car. I thought about heading right back into town to ask the cute librarian with the strong southern accent if she knew anything about the significance of the wall, but decided to wait. I hadn't slept well and needed to rest. I was startled to wake up later and realize I'd slept not for a couple of hours, but deep into the evening. I wrote it off to the dramatic change in heat and humidity, killing my stamina. My body clock thoroughly screwed for the time being, I lay there for a time, staring into the elusive darkness high above me, thinking about my benefactor, Uncle Herman, and how I'd never even gotten a glimpse of him after the age of 7. It wasn't only my father who discouraged knowing him. My mother also had nothing but scorn for the man, and the sad way he'd apparently wasted the inheritance left to him by his own parents. Weird old child-molesting deadbeat was a phrase that escaped her lips once at Thanksgiving when Herman was mentioned inadvertently. This was a reference to both his inability to stay employed and some legal problem he'd had with trying to marry an underage girl once. My parents were gone now. Every Dugan was gone, but me. The house and land that had passed through multiple generations were mine only because I was the sole remaining family member. I got up and puttered about the bottom floor of the house for a bit. I wasn't able to glean anything about Uncle Herman from what few possessions had been left behind, except that his taste in everything from photography to furniture was definitely second-rate. I did come across a couple of old Polaroids of him in a box of loose office supplies, pencils and tape and such. One was a night shot of him in front of a docked riverboat casino. Herman, then at least 50, was standing alone and smiling awkwardly at the camera in the harsh flash. He had very short hair and a not very trim mustache. Listening to classic rock very softly on his dusty stereo, I started to drift back to sleep on his sofa around 11:30, but I was roused by a distorted rectangle of light washing over me. That was followed by the sound of an engine outside. Someone was coming down the bumpy drive that led off Gallatin Road, tires so smooth on the wet dirt that if the window near my head hadn't been open, I wouldn't have heard it. I lay very still, hoping to hear the sound of a car being put into reverse as someone out there used the drive to turn around, surely having made a mistake. But the headlights refracting off the window glass left a small shape on the far wall that just hung there, unmoving. I grew worried that the opening of a car door would come next, and at that point I would have to act. My visitor and I were the only people around for a quarter mile or more. I felt defenseless and just a little scared. Finally, the engine did assert itself again over the din of the crickets out there and Elton John singing Daniel over a layer of static on the radio. The car began to retreat. The light slid up the wall like an invisible hand had grabbed it and yanked, and it soon disappeared. I wasn't convinced I was really alone again until I went to the window and confirmed it. My neighbor's herding little house well down the road, the one with a couple of lovely no trespassing signs nailed to it, was lightless. I returned to my discomfort on the sofa and stared into the tomb-like dark high above me, kicking off my thin blanket, disgusted by how hot it was. That was the night of the second rain, a pounding rain blown around in wobbly sheets and accompanied by occasional claps of thunder. It started at midnight and didn't let up until almost 5 in the morning. The chorus of structural complaints within the walls of the house was unceasing like before. But I was grateful to that rain for one reason. Surely my visitor wouldn't come back to kill me in my sleep if it meant more travel in that tedious downpour. Mist rose from the kudzu in the fields with a dreamy, spectral beauty as I walked across the property in the morning. It was all heartbreakingly beautiful then, everything so still and glistening in the quiet, the sun nothing more than a tarnished white coin in the sky, suffocated behind layers of gray. I felt like I was walking through a watercolor painting, and through the past of an extended family I knew so little about. The thin footpath that took me east was muddy, but I fully embraced it in my bare feet. On the way, I stopped and stared at the old, devoured shed for a time. All those tangled vines, those hungry leaves swarming it. The massive green blanket built by the invasive enemy, which cut off any northern shortcut possibilities, looked primeval and threatening, but seductive in a way, like it would be a fitting end to a human life to crawl into it and sleep and let time and nature encircle your rotting skeleton until you were just gone. At the far edge of the property, by the tree line, I got a shock. A man was standing beside the gentle field where I'd had such a pleasant experience the day before. He was facing the field, maybe admiring its simplicity and odd geometrical perfection the way I had. And for the longest time as I approached, he didn't hear me, even with my feet squelching like they did. When he finally did turn, he took a moment to openly study my face before speaking, as if he were processing a family resemblance. He must have been very close to retirement age, if not already beyond it. He didn't smile. He just nodded and introduced himself as Mike Bergeron. He asked me if I was the new owner of the property, and we exchanged the briefest of introductions. It was he who had come up my drive the night before, he told me, stopping well short of apology. A local coming into the self-storage place where he worked the late shift happened to mention a car parked at the old Dugan house, and he'd had the brief thought that it just might be Herman Dugan, whom he'd lost track of decades before. They'd had an acquaintance back in the late 60s, So Bergeron took the opportunity to swing out to the property, maybe say hello to someone from the past who may or may not even remember him. But upon seeing the out-of-state plates on my car there, he deduced it couldn't be old Herman, and he'd gone away again. Now, though, he was back, and I asked him what brought him specifically to the field. He turned to it again and told me he wasn't quite sure. Nostalgia, mostly. He and Herman used to come and smoke here after night shifts when they'd worked together at N-Palm. That was a name I didn't know. North Pomfret, he told me, was the old prison, over on the other side of the woods. There used to be a way through them, but it must have grown over at some point. He'd had a hell of a time getting through to the property, he said, barking a quick, hollow laugh that lacked the slightest trace of mirth. I noted how unhealthy he looked, too thin. He looked directly down at the patch of grass around his feet. Something about this little place, he said. I don't know. Peaceful, I volunteered after a long moment of awkward silence, and he nodded. The kudzu doesn't grow here, you notice? He said. Never came close. He took a couple of steps onto the field, not especially caring about getting his shoes more wet. He advised me I might want to be careful, though. Careful, I said. How come? He shrugged. Well, he said, you know, this spot after the rain, you get these, what do you call them? And he swung his right arm back and forth like a pendulum to try to demonstrate something. Runnels, he said finally. You could sink a bit. You could really sink. The notion seemed to trouble him, and he fell silent again. I felt the need to lighten the mood, so I got him talking a little about what he used to do at the old prison, and whether the great cement wall beyond the woods had been kept for historical reasons, which, yes, turned out to be exactly the case. He was helpful enough with his answers, but I got the sense he'd wanted more than anything to be left alone in that field, and that my presence was unwelcome. He had no particular reaction to being told Herman had passed away. I would have pressed him a little about Herman and what he used to be like, but Bergeron excused himself and said he had to get back to his car on the other side of the woods, setting off toward them. His memory was starting to fail faster and faster, he said, and if he didn't find the route he'd just come through fast, he'd never find it. He seemed frail as he parted the tree line and vanished into it, giving me one last backward glance. I raised a hand in farewell, which he did not return. I had intended to walk right back to the house, but instead I waited for him to get well on his way, and then decided to head into those woods myself. I hadn't brought any shoes, and I was wearing only my usual shorts and t-shirt, so it was a foolish, tick-inviting decision, but Bergeron had got me intrigued with a reference to something I'd missed on my first accidental visit to the old prison grounds. If the going through the woods was easy, I thought I'd try to make it there. If not, I'd turn back. Well, the going was not easy, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. I had to sense, rather than wholly see, the remnants of a path through those woods. A path Uncle Herman himself had cleared as a prison guard over the course of 7 years, commuting to work and back on foot from less than a mile away. It was only detectable by stopping every 50 yards or so and getting a feel for where there was an extended gap among the looming cypress trees. The kudzu had choked about half the area, and the mist was hanging on there, fanning out from low-lying, swampy patches. I could feel it now on my bare legs. At one point I seemed to be cut off from what I thought was the trail by a huge patch of the kudzu, and would have to walk right through it. The thought unsettled me, as if I had something real to fear from it. I'd learned from the librarian in town that it could grow upwards of 12 inches per day, which was disturbing, but hardly cause to believe it was going to pull me under and strangle me. Still, I got the creeps as my naked feet struggled through the deceptively delicate mass, and I was relieved to reach regular muddy ground again. Sweat was running freely down my neck and shoulders in that humid green tunnel. It was really only a 10-minute hike to the other side, and I came out in full view of the enormous wall just 100 yards away. I wiped my feet in the grass, getting at least a little of the mud off, and walked across the former grounds of the place some called N-Palm, now just an empty, kudzu-corrupted plain. I made sure to weave and reroute as necessary toward the wall so as not to have to touch any of it again. Bergeron had told me roughly where to look for the plaque that had been hidden by the kudzu for years. It meant getting very close to the wall and feeling through the foliage, trial and error. As I did so, I happened to look directly upwards to see the dark clouds coming together high overhead, swarming over the faded, hazy circle of ineffectual sun. I momentarily felt dizzy. It occurred to me that my skin had not touched true sunlight once since I'd crossed the border into Louisiana. Finally, there it was, the plaque. The kudzu was much too thick and resistant to tear away in that spot, so I had to read the plaque's text by methodically pushing and rearranging the stuff around each sentence. The message to visitors to this spot was brief. Former site of North Pomfret State Correctional Facility, it read, 1931 through 1974. This wall, marking the western boundary of the new inmate holding facility, is dedicated to the memory of Edward Darno, a prison guard for 11 years. His reform and whistleblowing efforts uncovered dangerous conditions and corruption within the prison. Ensuing humanitarian efforts to improve and ultimately close it ended with Darno being awarded the Governor's Medal of Courage. More than 30 former Pomfret prisoners attended his funeral in 1976. I felt antsy and irritable all afternoon, not wanting to go back to the house where I would have to wage a struggle against boredom, but not finding much in the area to intrigue me more than the natural imagery of my property did. I made myself wait till almost dusk before heading back, lingering beside a creek with a novel and the hypnotic sight of very sporadic raindrops tapping the water. I pulled into the driveway just after dark, but upon inserting my key into the lock on the front door, I found myself hesitating, reluctant to enter. I couldn't put my finger on why the vibes were suddenly so wrong, so instead I went walking again, this time in a very different atmosphere. The route I took back to the east field was exactly the same one as I'd taken before, but the landscape was well cloaked at night, and the kudzu merged visually into one long, humped beast on either side of me. The chant of the crickets was headache-inducing at first, but so relentlessly repetitive that it slipped into the crevices of my subconscious quickly. The sky was a dark purple, and the clouds far away showed occasional flashes of beautiful but ominous heat lightning. Under the fractured moonlight, the extent to which the east field was waterlogged became more evident. There was a tranquil silver sheen over the patches where the rain had settled almost evenly with the tips of the grass. I wanted to stand in the field again, under the crescent moon this time, and return to the pleasure of warm, soaked feet. I kicked off my sneakers and walked forward on that spongy turf. I counted my paces as I went to see how many it took to get to the field's center point. With each step, the water grew just a smidgen deeper, until I was literally sloshing through the field, soaked up to my ankles, and it actually became a bit difficult to raise my feet. It felt wonderful, actually. I was almost up to my knees at the end. The center of the field must have had a bit of a subtle fissure in it where the water was collecting more deeply, like Bergeron had hinted at, though visually it just wasn't there at all. I took off my t-shirt, turned, and hurled it as far behind me as I could. It splashed weakly and found a resting place half submerged in the grass. Then, feeling a bit silly, I lowered myself until my hips dipped just below the water, propping myself up on one hand, grasping the mossiness I couldn't see beneath the black and silver surface. My only nights ever in a place like this, I thought, encouraging myself to go all the way with the idea that had just entered my head. 5 seconds later, I was on my back in the field and literally floating face up in the warm rainwater from the night before. I laughed aloud, amazed at but grateful for this natural aberration. I felt like a curious, fearless child. Without a current of any kind, I was basically motionless. If I moved my body at all, I could feel the grass beneath me, tickling. And I didn't want that. I wanted to feel truly weightless, so I closed my eyes and emptied my mind. My ears were now below the water, and soon I heard an odd, hollow thumping at regular intervals from far away, as if the water went leagues deep and not only 12 inches, and some mythical sea monster were pounding restlessly at the interior of its undersea cave. It was a rhythmic, lulling sound, a mysterious acoustical phenomenon caused by, well, I didn't have a clue. Pressure in my ears, maybe? I had to rouse myself before I drifted off into a half-sleep, and for just a moment, I wasn't sure whether I'd been floating for 15 seconds or 15 minutes. Such was the nature of a sensory deprivation tank. I shifted my weight to prepare to rise again, and was shocked when my legs extended entirely beneath the surface of the water, and suddenly couldn't find a place to touch bottom. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," I said aloud, and flailed my arms in disorientation. Without any ground below me, I felt myself slipping down under the surface, and the bottom half of my face became submerged entirely. I tilted my head to the night sky to avoid swallowing water. The toes of my right foot finally made contact with a firm, mucky surface well beneath me. Frantically, I pushed off it, rising a bit and beginning to tread water, all conscious thought ending as my body went into full self-preservation mode. Paddling and splashing in the direction of the tree line far away, I soon felt my knees make inexplicable contact with the grass again, not more than 10 or 12 inches below me. I hauled myself up and stomped clumsily forward a few steps, torso and hair dripping, my ankles and feet submerged, but nothing else. Completely baffled, breathing hard, I turned and stared through the dark at the aberrant patch I'd just rescued myself from. It looked no different from any other. The tips of the protruding grass speckled the surface of the water all around in an elegant, painterly way. But there could be no doubt that the water there had held the full vertical height of my 5'11" body for several seconds before I escaped that sucking pool, and that my right foot had pushed off a very different kind of ground cover, something more lake-like, ocean-like even, unless I'd temporarily lost my sanity. I got off the field entirely and stood in the mud and kudzu that bordered it. I would not be going back onto it to retrieve my t-shirt. The crickets chanted, and the crescent moon disappeared behind ever-brewing clouds. Somehow I knew, the moment I stepped back into the house, that it was my final night there, that I wouldn't be able to endure the discomforts and the unease anymore. I ran a towel through my hair in the dingy bathroom with the 30-watt bulb. I hadn't showered since I'd gotten to Edenton, and only my bizarre field bath had cleaned me. Anxious as I was, I got even more so when the stereo suddenly didn't work, wouldn't bring in a single radio station. I rolled the dial through a constant belch of whiny static of subtly varying tones. I found that it actually comforted me as much as music would, so I left it on as I lay down on the sofa, volume turned very, very low. I mentally cycled through every possible explanation for my experience in the East Field, coming up with no hard answers. Thinking I was in for a long night of sleeplessness, I tried to at least position my body on the sofa for maximum comfort. This required turning my head on the pillow so that I was staring beyond the living room into the short hallway that led into the kitchen. Something about the visual of that passage bothered me now, though there was nothing different about it than there had ever been. In the dark, it just seemed more tunnel-like, cave-like, that I was comfortable with. A peculiar thought arose in my mind, caused by seemingly nothing, and that thought was, there's where it's about to happen. I found myself repeating the sentence silently, even moving my lips to do so, giving it form, because it felt right. It felt like the room, the scene, was on the cusp of some kind of change. All was perfectly still, but would not be for long, I thought. The hallway was going to reveal something if I kept watching. There was only one other time in my life when I felt I was subconsciously tapping into a future moment that was unable to conceal itself from me. Back in college, when I tried to walk home from a party at 1 a.m. and considered cutting behind the empty loading bays of a rundown strip mall as a shortcut, I'd had a sudden screaming certainty that someone was back there, unseen, who was going to do terrible harm to me if I did. This felt like that. Impossible to explain to a rational person. Impossible to deny. The stereostatic hummed and whined. There was the sound of a light switch, and suddenly the hallway was glanced by pallid ochre light from a bulb as impotent as the one in the bathroom. The shoulder-high antique floor lamp at the mouth of the hallway had been turned on, but no one was there to have done it. Following close on the shock of that moment was the thought that I did not remember a floor lamp ever being at the mouth of the hallway. I looked away ever so briefly, to my backpack on the floor near my feet. I could be out the door in 10 seconds on my way to a motel. I was about to move when someone spoke. "Eric was wrong about me," my Uncle Herman said to me. He was standing in the hallway, lit only on his left side by the bulb. Just as he appeared in the photograph I'd found, he was very small, much shorter than his brother, my father, Eric. The family had said he'd always been boy-faced and a bit skinny. Now, standing there, he looked old and sick as well. But he looked angry, too. Not for a moment did I think he was alive, and some terrible mistake had been made. I knew, instinctively, that he was not really there, that I was looking at Herman in the depleted physical state he had died in. "He was wrong," he said again, his whole body trembling slightly. He jabbed his finger toward me, almost in tears. "I could have been a chemist. I had the grades." I think I tried to speak then, but wasn't able. Uncle Herman kept his finger pointed in a threatening way, as if it were up to me to change the past. He turned with creaky slowness and took a couple of steps deeper into the hallway toward the kitchen, leaving all light behind him, becoming a silhouette. He turned back just before he reached the threshold of the other room. His face was a black blur, but his voice was still clear. "There's a fourth body, you know," he said, voice hoarse. "Shovel still in the shed." Without waiting for a response, as if I could possibly summon one, he turned and limped feebly behind the wall beyond the hallway. That route led to the back door of the house. His footsteps made only a faint scraping on the wooden floor as he moved. There came no ensuing sound of a door opening, no intrusion of the din of the crickets. Herman merely faded into silence. The floor lamp stayed on. I remained perfectly still, locked in fear on the sofa, before the rustling of what may have been bats high above me finally broke the spell and sent me rushing out of the house. But it was another 24 hours before it felt like that day even truly ended. At the end of those long hours, which I spent away from Edenton entirely, I drove through another unusually hot and humid night back toward town. But just short of the small green reflectorized sign on Reindeer Pike that told me I had 2 more miles to go, I made an important detour. A decrepit cement curve off the road descended rather dramatically toward the crushed stone parking lot of Top A Self-Storage. I guided my car carefully down, avoiding some of the bigger cracks in the cement. My headlights temporarily froze a red-eyed raccoon that came to its senses quickly and skittered off into some weeds as I passed. Top A was a typically depressing mini-maze of connected shed squares huddled in the dark, made sadder by its position at the base of a stretch of woods. The only thing about it that seemed professional was the intensity of the arc light beating down on a sign that advertised a free month of storage with a year's commitment. Mike Bergeron was easy to spot from the parking lot. A tall glass window looked in on a lobby lit by homely light pink fluorescence, and he was sitting at the counter and staring at an outdated desktop computer. I parked out front and went in. He looked up and seemed to recognize me, but did not visibly respond when I lifted a hand in greeting. I cued his memory about the other day to prevent the moment from becoming uncomfortable. He looked sad in his checkered flannel shirt and hand-lettered name tag, a man stitching together a not terribly dignified income late in life. I perched on the orange plastic stool on the other side of the counter, very aware of the stillness all around us. For all I knew, there was no one around for a mile or more. I told Bergeron I'd been wondering more about my uncle, because I'd never known him. "So you just got in the car and went out looking for me," he said with a stark cynicism that hadn't been evident when we'd met the first time. I dropped eye contact, looking at the wall clock. It was 10 till 9. I told him there were some things that weren't adding up about Herman or the house or the property. Bergeron asked what I was going to do with it all, and when I stated my intention to sell it as fast as I could manage, he looked at me squarely and said, "Well, it's haunted, you know." I waited for a laugh or even a smirk, but no levity was forthcoming. "There's 2 places I'd say that about," Bergeron went on. "One was this little creek bridge up near Church Point. I grew up there. Thing was all of 30 yards long, but somebody would drive off it every 6 months. Kid on a tricycle one time, swear to God. Beakley Bridge. That spot by your trees is the other place." "You spent a lot of time there then," I said, fascinated that he should be offering these unexpected words only 2 minutes after I walked in. He shook his head again and again, brushing me off. Leaving out the fact that I'd spent the night sleepless at a Red Roof Inn, I told him I'd spent much of the day at the library at South Louisiana Community College, where I'd read most of a book about North Pomfret State Correctional Facility. Bergeron was unimpressed, informing me that everyone in Edenton knew about NPOM, and the place didn't mean anything anymore. I asked him, trying to sound skeptical, if NPOM was the reason the field was haunted. Bergeron was quiet for a moment. It seemed to me from the way he often measured his words before he spoke them that he was a man of no small intelligence. "I wouldn't have told you yesterday, but today is different," he said. "Today, I wouldn't mind a little, what do they call it in church? Absolution. I don't know, I never went." He stood up briefly and turned off a couple of light switches, and though he said it was just about closing time, he made no suggestion that I leave. The pink-tinged light remained around us, but a couple of patches near the back door went out. We must have created a strange image to someone passing by on the road, maybe bringing to mind that famous Edward Hopper painting of the lonely diner on a street corner in the city. "Pomfret was the pit of hell for a guard," Bergeron told me. "Understand? Inside of 6 months I saw that. No room to put all the cons coming in, but that didn't stop the state from crowding it to the busting point. Bad sanitation. Lousy warden. I used to have nightmares about the cons cornering me in those skinny places, the workhouse stairs, the hallway to the fan room. They knew they had the numbers, see? So, some guards took it on themselves to be rough. They had to. As he spoke, he often looked right past me out the window, staring up the slope at the road. A tractor-trailer rumbled by, headlights stabbing the dark. They had to, he repeated. In those days you could feel a riot coming and it was just us standing in the way. No help. Pressure like that every day, that breaks something inside you. Don't ever let anyone tell you good men can't do horrible things, boyo. My uncle? I suggested. Now, he did smirk. I wouldn't say he was a good man to start with. Little, opie-looking pervert. But you never did anything, I said doubtfully. Not because I was some hero, he said. I was scared. I had a wife. His wedding ring, I noticed, was gone. He fished in the pocket of his shirt and brought out a crushed pack of Salems and offered me one. I declined. When he lit up, I saw his hands were just a little unsteady, likely from age. What was being done? I asked him, both titillated and disturbed that he was telling me so much so fast, with so little prompting. It was almost as if he'd been waiting for me for hours, ready to release the story, aching for it. I wanted him to slow down, give me more context, but I was afraid to lead him too much should he feel pressured and stop. The guys called it crowd control, he said, holding on. Maybe once in a while you'd have this con who was a real problem, like dangerous. So you lie awake at night thinking about him, even on your precious nights off, and you think how you'd feel just a little safer if that bastard was gone. Except he's never going to go. Ever. And maybe you come to figure out, because hell, there's nothing but time in that place day after day. You come to figure out he doesn't have a family. At least no family that ever comes to see him, never writes. And you and the guys who are protecting you and protecting each other in that hellhole start to talk a little about the situation. I asked if my uncle was one of the men who talked about it, and a Bergeron confirmed this with a quick nod through a cloud of cigarette smoke. This cop killer tipped Littlejohn up and vanished from his cell one day, he said. That was in 68. I couldn't figure it out. They said he had a heart attack in the night and got taken to Lafayette. I'd been at Empalm maybe not even 2 whole summers. Herman says to me in the changing room, "We put Tip in the Sacrifice Bunt Club." That's the first time I heard the words. Again, he shook his head several times. I got the feeling it was merely a futile denial of just how many years had passed, how much of his life had slipped away. Back then, he went on, the records weren't kept in such top shape, just file cabinets. Not everything even got written down. Not every con existed on paper the way they existed inside, and vice versa. What, I asked, riveted, was the Sacrifice Bunt Club? He crushed out his cigarette, grinding it methodically into a chipped ashtray, far beyond what was necessary to choke the life out of it. It was a relief valve, I guess you'd say. The smarter cons didn't need to be told what happened, but word trickled down, and that helped to get us some power back, keep the balance the way it should be. For some guards, it let something go. Stuff built up inside. Angry stuff. Dark stuff. And putting somebody in the Sac Bunt Club siphoned it off. He looked at me harshly, as if challenging me. "I'm not justifying it," he said. "I'm just telling you what it was like." I couldn't process exactly what was being told me about Littlejohn's fate. Bergeron sensed it. Couldn't put him out in the potter's field with the regular dead cons, he explained. Those graves got recorded. But past the trees, on the west side, on Herman's land, real quiet over there. I sat quietly for a time, mortified. The book I'd read that afternoon, by a professor at LSU had mentioned only rumors of stealth killings by guards and midnight burials at Pomfret, but suggested no one had ever uncovered any hard facts about them. Poor records indeed, and also maybe selective research. If it was a club, I said to Bergeron, there were others. Just two, he said. Last one was in 72. And I tell you, on my mother's grave, that one kept a riot from happening because Patrick Lecope was the devil walking the earth, and he was going to make the place blow up in flames. He was whipping up the white guys against the blacks. I confirmed with him that there were 3 bodies in that field. 3. I was helpless to keep myself from probing for ghastly details, like how far under they were. To which he replied that because the ground was so soft, they were, in his words, deep enough. The guards would wait until it wasn't too soggy out there, otherwise the digging would be tricky. I had him clarify that they would actually time killing someone for the ground to be suitable for burying. This occurred, he said, after a rain. Not too soon after, not too late. And yes, as far as he knew, my uncle was in on it every time. Why did it end? I asked. Bergeron shrugged. Eddie Darno stood up, he said. The state cleaned house in about 2 weeks. He became as contemplative as I'd ever seen him, lost briefly in his memories. That was a good man, he said with firmness, resolution. Same awful job as Herman and me, same conditions. Risked his life to set things right. Not that he was ever let in on any of the rough stuff. He couldn't be trusted. I shared with him the apparent failings of the book I'd read, and he brushed it off to the fact that the state had been in such a hurry to bury their own mistakes, they didn't even scratch the surface of all that was going on at NPOM. And you know what? He concluded. That was the right thing to do. Tear it all down, give Eddie Darno a medal for raising Cain about overcrowding. Let it go. Let it go. We returned to the subject of hauntings and whether he truly believed in them. Not like I've ever seen anything, he said. My auntie called Beakley Bridge a claimer. It's always looking for blood, she said. Girl who graduated top of our class in high school jumped off at her first year of college. Can't break your neck from a jump that short, but she did. Boyfriend found her. I walked across that bridge once after dark. You could feel it. He trailed off there. I couldn't bring myself to tell him about seeing Uncle Herman the night before and the enigmatic words he'd spoken. I got the sense I was talking to an unwell man who, no matter what he may have done or not done long ago, did not quite deserve to be frightened like that. Nor did I ask him why he'd really returned to the East Field. Instead, I made myself give him exactly the confessional space he seemed to want and need. That field, he mused, staring out at Reindeer Pike, where almost no traffic had passed since that tractor trailer. It was a good place to smoke for a while, but after Tip Littlejohn, it changed. The rain doesn't act right on it. Someday it'll give up what it's got under it. It has to. That's what you're going to be selling to someone else. He lifted a finger weakly to point at me, trying to be stern, almost like Herman had. You think about that, he finished. In only 15 minutes or so, he had revealed to a virtual stranger that he'd known of and never reported, never tried to stop multiple murders. This, I thought as I drove back to the motel, was what time and age had done to him. He'd stopped caring about consequences. But I'd soon find out that it was even worse than that. I sat on the windowsill of my scuzzy motel room in the bleakest hours of the night, looking out at the empty lot beyond a chain-link fence, cement riven with spidery cracks, an overturned skateboard lying in the middle of it. Like my uncle's house, the motel, too, was foundering in some sad twilight. Evidence of neglect and disrepair everywhere, even as the sign out front trumpeted an imminent renovation whose promised date of winter 2009 was now months in the past. The third and final rain of this story came shortly before dawn. I was still awake. The storm had been brewing for a couple of hours, and I'd been blasting the air conditioning to keep dry. The rain started to fall in a precise, even curtain, its rhythm unvarying. It was the sleeping pill I needed, and I was finally ready to turn to the bed, surprised to see by the green, glowing digits of the alarm clock that it was almost 5 a.m. That was when a particular beater car rolling by on the main road caught my eye and jogged my memory. It passed briefly under the glare of a blinking yellow light, and I could see the brown craft paper carefully taped over the spot where the rear left door glass was supposed to be, a crude temporary fix. Mike Bergeron was headed generally toward the south end of Edenton, where my uncle's property was, in the dead hour before dawn. It could well have been a coincidence. Maybe he lived out that way too, why not? But coincidences were seeming less and less likely, and inside of 10 minutes I was checked out of the motel, the sleepy clerk mumbling a distracted thanks when I dropped off my key. What I tried first was Soldier's Lane, on the chance Bergeron might be parking there again. It was a slim chance, but I was comforted to avoid the moment when I'd have to enter my uncle's house again. At any rate, his car wasn't there on the side of the road when I cruised slowly past the memorial wall once more, wipers squeaking, doing their best to keep up with the rainfall. In the leaden gray light, which would be very slow indeed to brighten the world that day, the wall loomed malignantly. I turned the car around, tires splashing through a deeper-than-expected puddle on the shoulder, and did not look back. My hands clenched hard on the steering wheel when I pulled up on Gallatin Road 5 minutes later and saw Bergeron's Honda in Herman's Drive. A sense of impending confrontation drew a lump into my throat. There seemed to be nothing I could do to avoid drawing this all to an end that felt painfully out of my control. The strange timing of everything perpetuated when, before I could even park my car, I spotted Bergeron himself far in the distance, his back to me, walking across the back field with the rotting wooden fence, approaching a copse of red maples. He, too, had found the thin footpath that led east. He was completely unprotected against the rain. Because of this, I felt I should be, too, so I made no attempt to reach for the umbrella in my back seat. As I got out of the car and started to walk around the side of the house toward the footpath, I noticed that the front door was ajar, just a few inches. I hadn't thought, in my haste to leave, to lock up such a worthless place. It was as if Bergeron had entered and then left again, either in a hurry or so unsettled by something in there that he'd become absent-minded. I left the car at the foot of the driveway and started east. Instead of trying to catch up to Bergeron, I kept as much distance as I could from him, while still keeping him barely in sight. My t-shirt and shorts were, once again, soon soaked through. Though I tried to keep mostly to the footpath that began at an old stone bird bath on the edge of the backyard, I weaved among the scattered trees to both shelter myself from the rain and conceal myself somewhat should Bergeron ever turn. But quickly that did not seem like it was ever going to happen. Despite his age, he trudged with determination over the wet ground, and I could make out in the dim light that he was wearing the same clothes as when I'd spoken to him at the self-storage place. He either hadn't been home, or, like me, had stayed awake all night, distracted. I lost him in the emerging mist. It rose dense off the grass and the masses of kudzu, and swallowed him whole, just past a gully of thorn bushes that marked the first point where, if I turned, the house would be hidden by a slight rise in the land and a thin screen of trees. On my first walk there on Monday, I'd thought of the spot as the edge of the Shire from the Lord of the Rings books. I kept going, and saw Bergeron's head and shoulders appear far up ahead. But he wasn't moving now. I stopped and retreated a couple of steps and waited, confident he couldn't spot me if I were to crouch a little lower and let the mist enfold me. More colorless light had broken through the clouds, just enough for me to take in the whole picture in sufficient detail. The old man had stopped at the place where the kudzu had suffocated an entire field, at whose center point the old shed slowly rotted under its vampiric embrace. He stared toward the shed, pelted by the rain, not moving forward, not moving back. A full minute passed. It was easy to picture an old shovel in there, still bearing traces of the mud streaks from 40 years ago, when it had been used for a handful of moonlight burials. If Bergeron wanted to find it, destroy it, merely touch it, anything, it wouldn't have been possible without some tool to cut through the tangles of kudzu that blocked the shed door and its single window. Finally, Bergeron moved on, resuming his journey toward the east field. Careful as ever not to be detected, I kept up, slipping twice in the mud. Around a curve and onto a stretch I had jokingly thought of as Heartbreak Bend, he went. It was a little meadow with 4 red maples that seemed to yearn for the company of young lovers on a picnic. That was the last section of the property before the east field, where, of course, his progress stopped. When I confirmed visually that he intended to go no further toward the tree line separating the property from the woods and the prison grounds beyond, I finally closed the distance between us. He stood before the field, staring down at it, just as he had the other day. Now the volume of rain created delicate and graceful currents that wove through the grass. Then he began to walk forward, moving toward the spot where I'd encountered the inexplicable. Almost immediately the water was up to his shins. From 20 yards behind him, I called out for him to stop. He turned, registering no surprise, almost as if he'd known I'd been following all along. The rain had matted down what was left of his gray hair. I think he was shivering despite his layers of clothing. "Herman's found me 3 nights running," he said, barely audible over the downpour. "All I wanted was to come see how he felt about things now. Maybe we could talk about it. But he just wants to shame me." For the first time since I'd met him, his voice took on real volume and forcefulness. "All right," he shouted. "I helped out one time. That one was alive when we got him over here. It was raining so hard we figured we'd drown him." He stared into the current swirling around his legs, the water reaching almost up to his knees. "So we did," he finished. Then, with a trembling hand, he fished a crumpled collection of tissues from the breast pocket of his flannel shirt. They'd clumped together wetly, but still he used them to wipe his nose, once, twice. Then he absently put the tissues back into his pocket. He even went so far as to fasten a little snap. "Don't go in the house," he told me. "Herman's in there." And then he tried to drown himself. There was no way I could have reached him, even though throughout his monologue to me I had been inching steadily forward, onto the field, my shoes sloshing. He turned in one easy motion and simply dropped entirely under the water. An impossible act, surely, because despite the rain, it couldn't have been more than a foot deep. Yet his entire body vanished as if he'd stepped off an undersea cliff. 1 second Bergeron was there, and the next he was gone with only the slightest splash. I yelled out something useless and stomped as fast as I could to his spot, maintaining my balance only with great effort. I made wobbly contact with the grass below for 2, 4, or maybe 6 great strides, and then, on the very last one, there was nothing down there at all to support me, and I, too, went plunging full body below the surface, swallowed by the field entirely, and the sound of the rain abruptly vanished. My panicked struggle for survival, my flailing and thrashing did not last long, because as I kept descending through a murky greenish funnel sucking me down, I realized I was somehow still breathing. The less I fought against the drowning, the clearer it became that my lungs were taking in oxygen, even though I was now several feet under the water. I could inhale and exhale normally. I craned my neck and saw the 1,000 dents of the raindrops puckering the surface high above me, and the daylight fading. By the time my shoes connected with the bottom of that inscrutable sea, I was calm enough to end all resistance. I stood in smooth but firm mud and turned this way and that, trying to discern any detail within the murk all around. Bubbles emerging from my nose and mouth obscured my sight. The color of the water was the color of toxic industrial fog and the deathly haze over battlefields. This world was completely silent. But then I did hear something behind me. It was the sound of a switch of some kind, as transmitted through the echoing sepulchral deep. I turned and saw, impossibly, that a shoulder-high antique floor lamp stood anchored in the mud many yards distant, its light shining dully. The one from my uncle's house. The one that I was not even sure truly existed. Again, it was prefacing something. Something coming. This time from a different entranceway. The lamp stood before a dark tunnel I could only see through a blurred, wet focus. The mouth of it was oval, ridged, a tremendous cave mouth, freed of all thoughts of not only my death, but any conscious action. I merely watched. They walked out of the mouth very slowly, the prisoners, bare feet lifting tiny tufts of earth off the bottom of the sea. They had little left covering their bodies. The rotting, state-issued cloth that used to protect them appeared dark gray or even black under the water. Their faces were almost entirely smoothed away, leaving only bumps and ridges to suggest human characteristics. Their hands and feet were nothing more than misshapen stumps, save for a few puffy toes and fingers still tenuously attached. All the hair on their heads was gone. Blind, they emerged uncertainly, but I felt they sensed my bodily form, and in almost single file instinctively followed a course towards it. I heard a weird vocalization to my rear and spun in that direction. A single, foggy, questioning syllable had been croaked from a human throat. A fourth prisoner was there, much closer to me than the others. It, too, was a stumbling zombie, reaching out without knowing what to reach for. Its features were more intact and distinct, its face deeply creased, toothless mouth opening and closing. Its eyes had rolled into the back of its head, revealing tortured red scleras. There was a true desperation in this one, a frantic energy. Its arms extended fully, anxious to grab whatever they could. It turned its body to the left, then the right, trying to detect any clue that might give it a path to release, or maybe just to a helping hand. I could almost read a number inked on the uniform it had worn in life, and through its passage toward death. Its soundless cries exuded confusion and a loneliness that it was so very desperate to end. My mind a sodden void, I swam upwards moments before its hands would have found me. The others had plodded nearer too. The last image I had of any of them was of one ghoul's head folding over onto its chest like a balloon filled with mud, the decomposed neck no longer having any structural integrity. I rose through the umber gloom, the weak but steady yellow glow of the antique lamp becoming smaller and smaller behind me. I broke the surface of the water back into the rainfall. A current carried me gently toward the eastern edge of the field, and I doggy-paddled with it. Mike Bergeron's body was floating face down nearby, the back of his shirt bloating. I passed within 2 feet of him as I drifted toward safety, and suddenly able to stand again, feeling the grass beneath me, I was able to turn him over and make a prolonged effort at resuscitation. But he had gotten his wish. He was dead. His open mouth began to fill slowly with rainwater, and when I was certain he was gone, I closed it, feeling as if my head were about to split open under the weight of the insanity I was wholly adrift in. I splashed out of the field and stood coughing and sputtering near the tree line, sinking to my knees in exhaustion. The administrative machinery of the world would take over now, though it would have to do so without as much cooperation from me as it needed. When reporting the discovery of Mike Bergeron in my field, I said nothing to the authorities about anything else I had discovered or experienced, and no trace of it was visible after the rainwater gradually dispersed. The field dried under the weight of a weather front that finally broke up the constant storms. It was just a field again, smooth and unfissured, and it was mine, and still is, home to 4 long-decayed corpses, not 3. The 4th, I gleaned from my research which followed that awful day, may have been a man named Leonard Poston, convicted of several violent felonies in his life, the last of which, the strangling of his mother-in-law, landed him in Enpom in 1971. Just 1 year later, I think he was taken from his cell in the middle of the night and murdered, with records forged to cover the traces. God grant he lie still under that field, and God speed its suffocation by the slithering kudzu that even today mysteriously stops shy of its accursed borders.
Spectrovision Radio.